In this segment, we'll continue conversation about school accountability using the summary lens. And we're going to continue talking about accountability aspects. In the first segment, we talked about high-stakes testing, we talked about school report cards, and we talked about supports to low-performing schools. In this segment, we will continue the summary by talking about rewards to high-performing schools and talking about school reconstitution, turnaround, and closure. So to start with, rewards to high-performing schools, it's important to note, just as in the case of supports to low-performing schools, that there's a lot of variation in terms of the way that states both measure whether or not schools are high-performing, but also the kind of rewards that are given for being a high-performing school. So I'm giving you here some of the criteria that are being used by states to identify schools as high-performing. And again, these line up with the criteria that they're using on their school report cards and the criteria that they're using to kind of put schools into groups relative to accountability systems. But it includes things like, are schools closing achievement gaps? This becomes really important because what districts and states don't want to do is to have high-performing schools only be the schools that serve the kind of highest achieving populations. Rather, there have to be some rewards for schools that are serving lower achieving groups of students and doing a good job with those populations over time. And so certainly closing achievement gaps is one way to measure that. So what is the distance in performance between majority populations and minority populations, between middle-class students and lower-class students, between white students and students of color? And so many states are using the achievement gap as a way to determine whether a school is high-performing. It's important to note on the measurement of achievement, that states are using both levels of achievement and growth in achievement. So the difference between those would be perhaps a state using the percentage of kids that are in the meets or the exceeds category and measuring progress over time on that, versus how much growth a school or grade level or individual teachers are getting with students over the course of a school year. And you see both of these kind of ways of thinking about achievement in terms of rewarding high-performing schools. In some contexts, in some states and districts, really the high-performing school status is limited to particular groups of schools. And so really only targeting the lower-performing schools, for instance, to receive these rewards of being high-performing. And sometimes it's tiered, and so the school district will be divided into categories based on the types of students that are served, for instance, or the parts of the district, the kind of regions of the district, and then high-performing schools are designated within the different tiers or regions. What do these schools receive? Generally speaking, recognition comes with all of these high-performing school designations across the country. In some instances, there's sharing of best practices from these schools, so whether these practices are codified in writing or whether they're distributed on the district website or whether these sites are opened up for other practitioners to come and visit. And then finally, some states are using this innovative kind of granting system where schools, if they're designated as high-performing, are eligible to apply for rewards grants. So not all of high-performing schools would receive grants, but getting into this category would put schools into the eligibility to apply for additional resources for their school. So the final kind of accountability aspect that I'm going to summarize has to do with turnaround and school closure. And important ways we can point to the No Child Left Behind Act and Race to the Top in really targeting this idea of turnaround. Although it's important to note that the idea of reconstituting a school, meaning either changing the teachers who work in the building or replacing the leader, which is the kind of foundational assumption behind the idea of turnaround. These ideas of reconstitution we see on the landscape in the United States as early as the 1990s. So certainly the No Child Left Behind Act and Race to the Top were not the beginning of these ideas, but I think they captured and codified them in a different way. So in terms of the No Child Left Behind Act, What I've outlined for you here is the specifications that are given for the requirement for districts to intervene in low-performing schools. And this is within 2 years of not meeting AYP, adequate yearly progress, within 3 years, 4 years, or 5 years. And what you see is this kind of increasing level of intervention that districts are supposed to make into these low-performing schools over the course of that 5 years. And the kind of culminating or end point at year 5 is this idea of reconstitution. So either replacing staff members, reopening as a charter school, hiring external management, et cetera. Similarly, in the race to the top, we see the inclusion of the idea of school turnaround in that competitive funding model, which, just to remind you, the assumption behind Race to the Top was in order to compete for these competitive funds, states had to focus on a particular set of issues, and school turnaround was one of those issues. So here, just to continue on that thought, is the summary of the Race to the Top school improvement grant requirements. And what's included in there is a set of specifications for states to consider and as a part of receiving points towards being able to get a Race to the Top or school improvement grant. They were expected to attend to these things, whether it be a turnaround model of replacing the principal, of replacing at least half the staff, of kind of giving more operational flexibility or autonomy over budgets to the principal, what Race to the Top called a restart model, which was closing and reopening as charter school, just a school closure, which was the notion of closing the school completely without a reopen, or a transformation model, which had several different kinds of specifications for replacement of staff, different kind of instructional reform levers, and different kind of flexibilities in connection to a different kind of use of time or community orientation. So what we see in terms of this last lever of reconstitution, turnaround, or closure is that in the mid-1990s, we see the reconstitution language appear in school accountability plans in districts and states. And then the turnaround concept got reinforced with the No Child Left Behind Act, Race to the Top, and school improvement grants. So that's the end of the summary lens. Next, we're going to turn to the analytical lens focused on school accountability.